Ah, the aperture is the number you see on the lens, but most importantly, it's one of the main tools that we use to create photos. It's one of the parts of the exposure triangle, but it's also a tool that helps with telling a story, and that's entirely thanks to its effect on the depth of field. However, I believe it's also a pretty misunderstood thing. And that's because we often create some imaginary rules that make us not use the full potential of it. And this is what I want to talk about in this video. So fate limitations and how do I approach this issue. When learning any art form, we often try to find the thing that will guide us to perfection. And in photography, I believe it's most often the aperture. Trying to get better by itself is not a bad thing. However, doing that by imposing some random restrictions is not really a great idea. So, for example, when we start out, we often shoot at the lowest possible aperture to get this nice out-of-focus background look. And over time we do this less and less, and after some point we don't use the lower apertures anymore. And that is a very big problem. Because in doing that, we don't use what's available for us. For honestly no other reason than to feel better about ourselves. I'm gonna be honest here. I don't believe that a photographer that shoots everything at f8 is better than one that shoots everything at f1.8. Often the only difference is the ego of the f8 shooter. And the reason for that line of thought is pretty simple. Different apertures are good for different things. The lower apertures, as mentioned before, will give you nice out-of-focus backgrounds, while the higher apertures will get your entire scene in focus. That's why I kind of cringe when I see people shooting everything at the same aperture constantly. Because I don't think that shooting with the same aperture time and time again is any fun. And it's also way less versatile. You won't achieve this with f1.8, but on the other hand you won't get something like this if you shoot at f8 only. So again, you have to change your aperture to match the situation. And I know that there are situations where you can't really change aperture, like when shooting street or certain events. The scene can quickly change and you can miss something while trying to change your settings. I know that, and often it's a pretty good excuse. But this is not always the case. I think there are times when you can spend the 1 or 2 seconds to change your aperture to make sure that the photo works better. And it's not the 19th century where you can't really do that easy or quickly. So please change your aperture to better show what you are trying to convey. Alright, that's the problem. But what is the reason for it? Well, I believe that it's because we creatives kind of want to have our own style. And in context of photography, having a set aperture is actually not a bad idea. But this shouldn't impede on fun or the intended look of the photo. You can have a style while shooting with apertures that match the situation. But also don't be afraid to have a day where you shoot with a certain aperture. It's a good training thing, but keep it at a day and not for a couple of months. Shooting with the same settings won't make a style, it will only make it less fun. But trying to have a style is not the only reason why we do that. There's also the fact that we might not have the best idea of what we are doing. As mentioned before, when starting out we often shoot with lower apertures. But over time we find it boring and kind of amateurish. So we stop using it. But then we kind of go to the other extreme, where we try not to use the lower apertures to not look like a beginner. And I'm gonna say it like this: if that's your only reason to not use lower apertures, you may still have a lot to learn. However, it's not really a problem when the aperture simply fits the photo. If 90% of shots work with f4 for example, then so be it, you aren't forcing it onto your photos. It just happened that this aperture works most of the time. The truth is, you can still be a real photographer with any aperture you want. Yeah, with certain genres it might be harder and stuff, but you can still do it. It will just take a little bit more thinking. But hey, isn't that what creativity all about? There is also the fact that we humans are naturally lazy and don't want to change things, but that's neither here or there. So go out there and shoot photos with whatever aperture you think will fit the situation, and maybe even consider subscribing to this channel. Bye!